the honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand and speak to S-14, an act to amend the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act. I will be sharing my time with my honourable colleague from La Salle-Imar. In looking at this, I find myself yearning to see a companion act introduced in this House that should be entitled an act to amend the Corruption of Domestic Public Officials Act. Given the record of this government, I've got a whole host of things that we could be dealing with. In terms of domestic corruption, we could be trying to deal with $90,000 payments to senators made by Prime Minister office officials allegedly to cover up illegal activity. We could be investigating Canadian senators fraudulently claiming housing and living expenses. We could be looking into people like Arthur Porter, a former prime ministerial appointment to the CSIS Oversight Board, who apparently helped himself to millions of dollars in public taxpayer dollars in Montreal and who fled to South America, another Conservative. We could be looking into Conservative candidates like Peter Panashaway, who overspent election limits, effectively buying his seat by cheating. We could be looking into robocalls where the Conservative database was used to commit election fraud, and then watching the Conservative Party try to obscure and fight against any kind of attempt to bring transparency to that procedure. So, Mr. Speaker, we have domestic corruption of public officials galore with this Conservative government, and I look forward to this government introducing a bill that will attack and finally clean up politics in this chamber and in this House for Canadians. But unfortunately, that is not the bill before us. We're dealing with foreign public officials. So the NDP, being a party that stands for ethics and transparency in Canadian politics, is proud to support this bill for referral to committee. And this bill makes four main changes to the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act. It increases the maximum sentence of imprisonment applicable to the offence of bribing a foreign public official from 5 to 14 years. It eliminates an exception for so-called facilitation payments. Now, there's a euphemism, if I've ever seen one, where a foreign official is paid to expedite the execution of their responsibilities. I guess they call it facilitation payments. I call it a bribe. And it creates a new offence for falsifying or concealing books or records in order to bribe or conceal bribery of a foreign official. And it establishes nationality jurisdiction that would apply to all of the offences under the Act, such that Canadian nationals could be prosecuted for offences committed overseas. Now, again, New Democrats have long supported clear rules requiring transparency and accountability by Canadian individuals and corporations overseas. Frankly, unfortunately, usually opposed by the Conservatives. This bill complements legislative efforts by New Democrat MPs to encourage responsible, sustainable and transparent management practices. Au Canada, les lacunes dans l'application des lois contre la corruption sont une source d'embarras pour le pays. Nous sommes heureux que le gouvernement se penche enfin sur ces problèmes, mais il est déplorable que cela ait pris autant de temps et que le Canada ait dû être dénoncé et discrédité pour que le gouvernement agisse. Canadians want our companies to be successful and responsible representatives of Canada. We want Canadian companies to have clear, consistent standards for international business. Enforced, loophole-free regulations will create a level playing field for all companies while ensuring environmental, labour and human rights protection, of which we all can be proud. Some background, Mr. Speaker. In a 2011 report, Transparency International ranked Canada as the worst of all G7 countries with regards to international bribery, with, quote, little or no enforcement, end quote, of the scant legislation that exists. Since then, the government has been responding to this national embarrassment. However, there have only been 3 convictions since 1999, 2 of which were in the last 2 years. I'd like to see this government get tough on corruption when you have 3 convictions since 1999. That is hardly being tough. By repealing the facilitations exception, this bill will bring Canada into line with the practices in 36 of 39 other OECD countries. However, while the rest of the bill will come into effect as royal assent, the rules on facilitation payments will take effect at an unknown future date at the will of Cabinet. Now, the Books and Records Rule is already being enforced in the United States at the civil level by the Securities and Exchange Commission, but Canada has no equivalent regulator. While criminal law achieves the same effect, I think that we should be increasing our efforts in this regard. Mr. Speaker, this bill is particularly relevant to the extractive industry, where the NDP has been and remains the strongest advocate for accountability in this House. Examples include my honourable colleague from Burnaby New Westminster's C-323, as it then was, which would allow lawsuits in Canadian courts by non-Canadians for violations of international obligations, and my colleague from Ottawa Centre's C-486, requiring public due diligence by companies using minerals from the Great Lakes region of Africa. I point out that bill, the mining bill, was opposed by the Conservative government, and 13 Liberals failed to show up for the vote, which led to the narrow defeat of that bill by 6 votes. So again, Canadians can only count on New Democrats to bring mining practices, corporate social responsibility of Canadian mining companies into international normative standards here in this House. L'élite politique qui profite de la corruption, particulièrement dans les pays et les secteurs où la corruption est la plus problématique, est principalement composée d'hommes. Parallèlement, ce sont surtout les femmes qui manquent de protection gouvernementale. Now, while we support this bill for referral to committee, this bill does have some concerns. It will amend the definition of a business to include not-for-profit organizations. At committee, New Democrats believe this clause should be carefully studied in relation to its impact on charitable and aid organizations, which may, in the real world we live in, have to make occasional payments in order to expedite or achieve delivery of essential assistance. We must take great care around that. The committee should also study the consequences of establishing an indictable offence punishable by up to 14 years in prison, as this is the threshold at which conditional or absolute discharges or conditional sentences become impossible. Finally, the committee should study whether the rule on facilitation payment should take effect at the whim of Cabinet, as is in the current text of the bill, rather than when ordered by Parliament. Here are some key facts and figures to consider, Mr. Speaker. There have been 3 convictions, as I've mentioned, under Canada's foreign bribery law since it took effect in 1999. Hydro Clean Group was fined $25,000 in 2005 for bribing a U.S. immigration officer at the Calgary airport. Nico Resources was fined $9.5 million in June 2011 because its subsidiary in Bangladesh paid for a vehicle and travel expenses for the former Bangladeshi State Minister for Energy and Mineral Resources. And Griffiths Energy International was fined $10 million in January of this year after it agreed to pay $2 million to the wife of Chad's ambassador to Canada and allowed her and 2 others to buy shares at discounted prices in exchange for supporting an oil and gas project in Chad. We all are watching in the newspapers as we see the difficulties that SNC-Lavalin has gotten itself into in terms of allegedly paying bribes to foreign officials to secure contracts abroad in the millions of dollars. Now, the Transparency International Bribe Payers Index in 2011 ranks the oil and gas and mining industries as the 4th and 5th most likely sectors to issue bribes. Now, this should be of great concern to Canadians because Canada is a world centre for mining and oil and gas industries and companies. And these companies should, among all sectors, as stakeholders, want to establish very clean, high-level regulations and rules regarding acceptable corporate conduct. So, moreover, the mining and oil and gas industries are the 2nd and 3rd most likely to engage in grand bribery targeting high-ranking officials and politicians. So this makes a bill like S-14 especially important in these sectors. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude by saying le fait que le gouvernement n'applique pas les lois contre la corruption est une véritable honte nationale. Nous sommes heureux que le gouvernement se penche enfin sur ces problèmes. Il est toutefois déplorable que cela ait pris autant de temps et que le Canada ait dû être dénoncé et discrédité pour que le gouvernement agisse. For business, for the environment and labour, for Canada's international reputation, Mr. Speaker, we urge this bill to go through Parliament, and I urge the government to make the amendments necessary to get the support of all parties in this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député de La Salle-et-Mar.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais remercier mon collègue pour son discours et également pour tout son travail en tant que notre porte-parole pour le commerce international. J'aimerais lui demander justement de nous parler, en fait, d'élaborer que c'est de plus en plus important que toutes les compagnies, qu'elles soient canadiennes ou un peu partout, mais notamment qu'elles soient canadiennes, respectent justement le contrat social qu'il y a, par exemple, quand on implante une compagnie, quel que soit dans le monde, et également qu'on a une responsabilité sociale de pouvoir faire en sorte que les communautés dans lesquelles on s'implante, elles soient respectées. Alors, j'aimerais qu'il élabore sur cette question.
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take this moment to thank my honourable colleague from La Salle-et-Mar for her fine work that she does in this House and for her contributions to the debate, which are always of very high quality and perceptive. I think what the question really raises is the fact that in a global world, in an increasingly connected and interconnected world, what Canadian companies do abroad matters. It's always mattered, I think, but never has it been, I think, so fundamentally important to Canada's reputation on the world stage that our corporations act above reproach, that we set a standard on the world stage for conducting business in a legal and ethical manner. And it's only by doing that, by showing an example here in the Canadian Parliament, by requiring high standards for Canadian corporations acting abroad, that we can legitimately urge other countries to carry the same standards in their jurisdictions as well. And I think it's something that what we all want in this House is we want standards of ethics and legality to improve here in Canada and around the world. And I think that we can start by passing laws like this and actually put some teeth into these laws as well.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's speech. We have had versions of this debate in a previous session when a private member's bill was brought forward around corporate social responsibility with a particular emphasis on the mining company. And I know the diminishing caucus of the NDP with respect to mining might explain why they're more focused on government intervention. But when I attended the PDAC conference this year, the year prior, there was a lot of excitement about E3+, a program that inspires and sets out a framework for the corporations, particularly mining and energy companies, to act responsibly when abroad, and the balance, Mr. Speaker, to keep corporate operations here in Canada, particularly for our mining companies. So I was wondering if this member could comment on what his proposals might be or his thoughts on actually letting the industry do some self-regulation when it comes to corporate social responsibility, rather than this paternalistic kind of approach that he's advocating.
The member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the only thing that I see diminishing in this House is the integrity and credibility of the Conservative government over the last 2 months. And I think all Canadians just have to open up a newspaper to see that. You know, I don't know what the member's talking about. I mean, we have members on this side of the House, like the honourable member from Nickelbelt, who actually was a miner. We have people this side of the House, like the honourable member from Ekati Bathurst, people who worked in the mines of this country.
Second time today.
We don't take any lessons from the Conservatives about experience or what's healthy for the mining industry. But I think what is important is that corporate social responsibility is an issue. Right now, we've got a serious investment by a Canadian mining company in Chile that has been halted by the Chilean courts, the Pascua-Lama mine, because of environmental degradation and violations of Chilean law. We just heard from a Greek delegation about a Canadian company's mining operations in northern Greece that is causing great concern among those countries. So, you know, it's time that we recognize that Canadian mining companies play a very important role in our economy, but they benefit from having strong laws and ethics apply to them too, and the whole world will apply by watching Canada expect more from our corporations. It's good for business, it's good for Canadians, and it's good for Canada's reputation, Mr. Speaker.